wheelchair seating clinic specialist. Now with ROHO, Tricia is presenting educational programs to therapists and DME providers regarding seating, positioning, and pressure imaging. She's an active member of the APTA, RESNA, and Clinical Task Force. Josh Anderson has 19 years of experience in manual wheelchair mobility and is currently overseeing production and brand management at Tylite, a manufacturer of ultralight made-to-measure manual wheelchairs. He has presented extensively at conferences including ISS, Canadian Seating and Mobility Conference, CRT Conference, RESNA, RehaCare, and Metrate on a number of topics such as fitting a wheelchair like a prosthetic, manual skills training, the evolution of manual mobility, and material considerations for manual mobility. And last but not least, Doug Garven, an industrial designer, has been a leader in wheelchair design for over 20 years. He has designed for a variety of companies, ranging from the large, well-established companies to small startups. In each case, Doug contributed innovative chair frames, worked with unique materials, and pioneered designs that remain prominent today. In 2009, Doug joined Tylite and has been leading the design team ever since. With no further ado, your speakers.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'll start again. I'm the only girl. I'm Tricia, and if you noticed, we do have the same last name, my husband, Doug. So we're very excited to drag Doug into this. Doug's got a lot of good information and knowledge, so he's very uncomfortable with this, but we made him do it anyway. Vanessa had some nice paragraphs to read about us, but we do feel like it's very important that we do disclose clearly we work for a couple of manufacturers. Today isn't necessarily about any particular brand, but it is important that you know that I am the clinical education person for ROHO. These boys both are at Tylite, and if Josh, you want to say anything.
Well, I think, can everyone hear me?
No? Is my mic on? Okay, there we go. So I'm Josh Anderson, and I work for Tylite, and I'm the product and marketing person for Tylite. I've worked for Spinergy. I started Spinergy's wheel division. Started in the industry working for a dealer 22 years ago. I see Julie Gavey, who's looking for a seat right now, who was my therapist at Shepherd almost 30 years ago. So I basically only worked in this industry my entire career. I love it. I love the idea of improving somebody's mobility, improving my own mobility. And hopefully today we can show you a couple of little tricks and tips to help other people out with their mobility.
Hi, and I'm Doug Garven. I have been within this industry for quite a while. We'll see how far back some of you go to remember some of these companies. Started off with Everest and Jennings, and then was part of the Vision Group, which was a high-end performance division of Everest and Jennings. From there, I started worked for several years with Sunrise and Quickie. And then from there, I was with Cushall and worked in Europe for a couple years. And since then, I've been with Tylite, so getting around.
Good. And I think you basically got all the good info on me from Vanessa. My story's a little simpler than these guys. I, just went to PT school and got a great job in Dallas, Texas. Worked at Baylor Rehab and worked on the spinal cord inpatient team and did some outpatient seating as well. So that's it. So today we're really excited to be here. I'm super thrilled that that Josh and Doug are with me to sort of complete the circle and just give you some opportunity to ask questions too at the end of these guys specifically regarding personal experiences. They've both been in chairs quite a long time, and so they have a lot of great information from working in this industry, but also utilizing the equipment as well. So kind of how this talk started and the idea that we had was, wouldn't it be great to have a talk about just completing that circle? I like that term of just fulfilling the vision. You've had that that patient before that you're like, yes, I can't wait to do your equipment. It's going to be great. You are going to go out, tackle life, you're going to be so successful, and I'm going to be a part of that. I'm excited. And then you're like, oh, so then first, either you're scared to death, because that's a big responsibility, right? So you're like, oh gosh, how am I going to do this? And what am I going to do? How do I take all those measurements and that mat eval that I know how to do, and we're not going to get into that, and turn that into a wheelchair? And how do I know what frame configuration and dimensions that I want to do, and how do I put that all together? Plus all the seating components too, which is sometimes the simpler part, especially with custom manual equipment. And then sometimes it's like, yeah, it's good, but it's not quite what I envisioned. What went wrong? What might I have done better? Or what can I do so that I don't have that experience? So that's kind of the premise and what we were talking about when this whole talk started. So I kind of already gave myself away, but as the therapist specifically, the provider too, sometimes you have to do this part without the therapist, but especially when the therapist is involved, we do our part and we do it well. We meet the client, we do a really good interview and history. We don't forget to ask anything. We know exactly where they're gonna go, how they're gonna transport their chair, what their expectations are, where they live. We know everything. We've done a really great job. We did our mat evaluation. We know what size and shape they are, what they're comfortable or capable of doing, what their body's like, their strength, their balance, their range of motion. We know everything. We've done a really great job. We measured them up properly. We got all the measurements. We wrote a killer LM in. We know funding's gonna say no problem, right? This is not the real world right here. But right, we know, even so, we do the appeals. We know that we can get funding for what we wanna do, right? We have this vision, we have to, sort of execute it. And that's really what we're doing and what we're trying to do. Maybe I'll take this right now.
Okay.
Josh. But this is it. You're like, clearly very cute subject, isn't he? Yes, I married him. But this is it. This is what we want. We want perfection. We want this person sitting in the wheelchair to be comfortable, to feel comfortable, to be maximally independent, functional, maneuverable, all that. This is what we want. This is what we're going for. But sometimes you'll see just how stubborn and dramatic Doug can be. It's okay. He looks pretty good. It's just not quite right, right? So if you can see here, my very silly husband is proving a point. Clearly his friends and wife are involved. But all that's changed, this is his wheelchair. The dimensions are good. The configuration is good. The only thing we changed here, if you notice his bright red cushion, is the cushion. It's 2 inches longer than it needs to be or should be, right? So what's that doing? Well, you can see pretty clearly it's up in his knees, behind his knees. It's forcing him to posteriorly rotate, change his posture. So now he's slouching in the chair because he has to for his lower leg clearance. This is creating this kyphotic C-shaped slump-type posture, which then affects his shoulders. It affects his propulsion. Clearly, he was very dramatic about it, right? But really, it's not allowing him to be maximally functional because of just one little change. His seat depth, his seat, in this case, just cushion length, though, was just a little bit too long. And that was one little thing makes a big difference and doesn't allow him to be that maximally independent, functional person that we know he can be. That's that vision that we had for him so that he can go out. He's very uncomfortable right now. Right? I didn't ask if we could put these videos in there. He's like, what? But anyway. But this is what we're going for, and that's kind of just to prove the point that, one little bitty change does make a big difference. So we've talked already a little bit about this, but the objectives of this talk are to look at the ways that customizing a wheelchair do make a difference, the things that you can do to address those functional needs of the end user. And also we want to look at those changes and those expected changes over time throughout the lifespan of the equipment. The equipment has sort of an expected lifetime that we expect it to last. And then we want to talk about that kind of the concept or the idea of a prosthetic wheelchair. Building the wheelchair and the dimensions and the shapes of the chair, plus the seating too, around the person versus just picking something and fitting someone into it. We want to just individualize it to the person. That makes good sense, right? Yes, you're here, you agree with us. This is a cool topic. We think so. So here's our story. We're just going to have the same patient with the same complaints and talk about how you can, what might be going on with him. So this is Michael. Michael's he's a big guy, but a pretty average guy, right? He's 6'1", 255. Okay, he's a big guy, right? Kid, really. He's 18. He just broke his back. Still has his TLSO on. Brand new injury, T12. He's on and this is his demo chair now. He's on a 3-inch cushion, and he's getting by, but it's not great. We haven't spec'd this out for him, and it wouldn't be perfect if we did, right? This isn't the best posture. You can clearly imagine the mobility that he's gonna have in this chair, but pretty average, 18 and a half hip width, legs upper and lower are both about 20 inches, and his flexibility, everything's good. He doesn't have any issues. He's a young, healthy boy, except for just had a pretty serious injury. So, have you ever heard, this is kind of the premise of the talk, have you ever had somebody in their chair and say, yeah, it's all good except for, first complaint, I'm sliding forward in the chair. My legs are kind of splaying out, abducting, they would say, had they gone to PT or OT school, right? My legs are sort of frogging out or flopping out. It's okay, but it's not perfect. It's not great. So things that we want to look at, first and foremost, especially you can think of this two ways. If the chair is already his, and we're going to pretend like somebody who really is not our colleague and coworker, who wasn't really sure what they were doing, right? We all know that person. They're not here because they're not out learning about more and better, getting all the latest and greatest news. But so it could be that this chair already exists and this is his chair. And so we do have some seating components and parts and pieces that we can replace to maybe make it better. And we're also going to talk about the frame considerations and geometry and choices that you make potentially to avoid hearing this complaint later on. So first we're going to look at the seating. The seating parts and pieces could make a big difference with this complaint. Specifically looking at his back height, his back angle. Do you or don't you have a solid backrest even on the chair? If you're not supporting him, and this is a unique situation too, he's T12 injury, he's gonna have quite a lot of trunk control and balance and ability to compensate, but he's got that TLSO on right now. So he's a bit tippy now. We know he won't be as tippy later. Y'all know what I'm talking about. So we have to think about what's going on currently, and then in 3-6 months later, and then 2-3 years later after that even, with this first equipment. Like I kind of alluded to earlier, that first wheelchair, in my opinion, is the most difficult. It has to go through the most evolution in accommodating skill sets, really. So anyway, we want to look at that back height, make sure we're supporting him appropriately. What angle is that chair at? If that backrest is too forward, or if it's too closed, if you will, he's not going to have that balance, and so he could be rocking back, posteriorly tilting, sliding out to compensate, or it could be that back angle's too open and he's just sitting back there kind of lounging. And so then we have to compensate with a whole lot of other parts and pieces to make sure he's stable and not tipping over backwards. I mean, this kid's gonna be without anti-tippers quickly, but not if he's leaning back on that chair, because he's always gonna be catching himself on those tippers, right? So we wanna make sure that his back angle's appropriate. We wanna make sure that if we're using a solid backrest, that we're accommodating or planning for that seat depth, measurement and simple little math. If that backrest is going to take up a 1/2 to 1 inch, maybe even a little bit more, we want to build that into the chair that we're speccing out for him, because his legs could be flopping out, abducting, if he doesn't have enough lower extremity support. Well, that could be all those things we just talked about with that slouched, posture, either from reclining or compensating for the backrest that's not appropriately angled for him. And so now what's he doing? He's sliding forward in the chair, essentially shortening up his seat depth. So now we're not supporting as much of his thighs as we planned on or could or should be doing, and that's allowing his legs to flop out because there's not as much support. Or it could just be simply that seat to footrest adjustment. It could be just we need to tap that foot plate down a half an inch so that now we're loading his thighs better. It could be easy. It could be really simple, but we still have to identify it, recognize it, do something about it. No, you have.
Thanks. So I think Trish just covered the next 3 slides for me, so I'm just going to skip ahead. So what we're going to look at, and what I want everybody to try to do is, Trish kind of set up the scenario for Michael, and what I want everybody to do is kind of think about what would their possible solutions be for Michael in terms of fixing his setup. But before we do that, let's take a look at his demo chair and the spec on his demo chair. So currently, that demo chair that he's sitting in has a 16-inch wide footrest on it. It has a 19-inch deep seat. His seat to footrest measurement is 17 inches. And everyone, I think, understands these measurements. If you don't, then let me know. But his front seat height, 20 inches. His front frame angle is an 85-degree front frame angle. His backrest angle is 89 degrees. So just so that we're all clear, 89 degrees is a little bit forward of 90. So it's a closed back angle. And his rear seat height is 18.5 inches. So that's the current setup on Michael's demo chair. And he's having problems with what? He's having problems with his legs flopping open, right? So let's take a look at what we could do to rectify some of that for him and to properly set up the chair. So first thing we could do is change a little bit of the width of his footrest. Did everyone see how wide his footrest was? So 16 inches. So we could taper that in a little bit. What's that going to do? That's going to help to control his lower extremities a little bit more by actually using the chair to do so. The other thing, which it was very difficult to see from that photo, is that the seat was hitting the back of his legs. Now, it was just barely touching the back of his legs, but he was already sacral sitting in the chair. So that seat depth was probably a little too long for him, even though he is a big guy. So one of the things that we could do so that he could sit up easier without having his legs jam into the back of the seat sling is shorten his seat sling. Now, he is a big guy, and if we shorten his seat sling and we don't compensate for that, then the chair is not proportionally going to follow Michael's build. So the other thing that we can do is we can actually leave the frame length at 19 inches and just shorten up the seat depth in relation to the frame. Is that pretty clear to everyone? Okay. Now, his seat to footrest measurement was 17 inches, and that measurement seemed to work really well for that 3-inch cushion that he was sitting on. So we can leave that as is. But oftentimes, like Tricia said, that's typically a starting point, looking at if that seat to footrest measurement isn't long enough, and therefore it's causing his legs to flop out so that they can load properly. Now, another thing that we can do is we can look at why is he sliding forward in the first place. And maybe it's due to his TLSO. Maybe it's also due to there's not enough seat slope in the chair, given his functional level at the time. So what we can do is we can lower his front seat height, and we can also change his front frame angle. And we can change his front frame angle so that we can keep his feet in the proper position. So by changing the front frame angle to 80 degrees, his feet stay in the same position, almost relative to his seated position, but proportionally, the chair is following more the length of his body. We also can open up his seat to back angle. We can do that so that way, when he's in the TLSO, when he's pushing, he's getting a better contact fully through the backrest. And we can also lower his rear seat height. So by doing a lot of these different measurements, what we've created is just a more stable position for Michael to sit in all the way around. It's lower to the ground, so his center of mass, and you'll hear us talk about center of mass meaning his whole entire body is lower to the ground. So he's more stable. And then he's at a little bit more of a seat slope. Now it's not that much more, and it seems like it's significantly more if you look at 16.5. But all we did is we made it a 2.5-inch seat slope, but we lowered his whole body down. So this is what the two chairs look like side by side. You can see the before chair and the after chair. And you can see how the angle of the seats is slightly more. You can see how the front frame angle is slightly less. And overall, his overall chair length from the back of the rear wheel to the front of the footrest is relatively the same. Why is that important? Because we want to make sure a bigger guy like Michael is able to turn around in the same amount of space. So what we've done is we've seated him more properly so that he's more comfortable, more functional in the chair. His legs are not flopping out, but we still left the same amount of mobility. We haven't decreased his mobility. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay. So another thing that you all often hear is everything is great except my wheelchair is tipping forward when I hit a bump or when I start to transfer. Often have you heard that? Pretty often, right? It's like a common complaint. So, Tricia.
So on this one, the seating components and parts and pieces don't make as big a difference, especially on front end stability. I mean, we want to identify and make sure that the seating is good and that all those things, the reason that he was sliding out, kind of apply here too. We want to make sure that, we're seating him properly, but most of the time this comes down to the dimensions of the chair. So there's not a whole lot to say here, but more in terms of frame configuration for that front tippiness.
So, possible causes for this, and again, what we're going to look at is just a wide range of things. And I think, as you guys are thinking about this isn't limited to just these possible causes, but it can be outside of that. But what we're trying to do is identify some of the major ones. And when you're going in the field and you're doing these, kind of put together a plan for how you want to tackle them, because you don't necessarily need to do all of them. You may find that you're able to change just a couple of things, change the seat slope on the chair, for example, the seat depth relative to the frame length, and solve a lot of these problems. So these are possible causes for a chair being forward tippy. Seat to footrest measurement, footrest width, seat depth, backrest angle, and seat slope. And basically, if you think about all of these, again, we're going to talk about center of mass, the individual's weight relationship to the frame. And when we look at Michael's chair, again, this is the same demo chair, so we'll just go quickly through all of those dimensions. All the same. Now, what we did is we talk about the full chair length as well. So 33.9 inches is his chair length, again, from the back of the rear wheel to the front of the footrest. So that's how the space he needs to actually maneuver to turn around. And a 19-inch seat depth. Now, take a look at what we did to solution making the chair forward tippy for him. This isn't quite going right. There we go. Okay. So, what do? We lowered his front seat height to 19 inches. And this is critical because we're, again, moving his center of mass down. We made that front frame angle 80 degrees. Back angle, 92 degrees. Rear seat height, 16 and a half. So we've increased his seat slope, like we talked about. And by changing his front frame angle, we did make it a little bit longer, but less, just over 1/4 of an inch longer. So 33.9 to 34.2. So it's just a bit longer in terms of the overall frame length. But by sitting him much lower and changing his front frame angle and making the chair more proportionate to his body, just like a race car, center of mass is low. So by keeping it really low like that for him, we increase his stability. By increasing that frame length, or leaving his frame length the same at 19 inches and shortening his seat depth, we've created a more stable platform. We've moved the front wheels further forward on the chair. So now most of Michael's weight is over the top of his rear wheels. And by the way, typically on an ultra lightweight manual chair setup, you want about 80% of the user's weight over the rear wheels. That helps with decreasing the rolling resistance on the front wheels. It makes the chair more maneuverable, helps it to track straight when you're on crown surfaces.
That's actually a good point to bring up too. Chairs have as we've learned more about the chair design and what makes for more efficient propulsion, chairs have gotten shorter, and that leads a lot to the front tippiness that a lot of the more modern day chairs have. And like anything, it's a trade-off. You know, you have to know exactly what your client's intended use is. If it's going to be more for outdoor, where they have outdoor access, needs for that, then you can go with a longer frame because you want that stability. That stability creates maneuverability problems, though, when you come indoors. And that's why you've seen chairs have gotten shorter and more compact over the years.
So one of the ways we kept this really the same overall chair length is we also moved his center of gravity forwards. So his center of gravity on his demo chair was 3.5 inches. We moved it forward to 4 inches, and that's something that Michael's able to tolerate. So what we did, again, is place more of that center of mass over the rear wheel. We decreased his overall chair length on the chair. And what we didn't notice, because the slide kind of got screwy, was that we went from a 5-inch front wheel to a 4-inch front wheel. Now that's almost opposite of what everyone in this room would think, because it's a fact that a 5-inch front wheel or a larger front wheel of any size is going to clear a bigger bump. But we're able to go to a smaller front wheel because we've changed the proportion of his chair to fit him better. He's more stable in it. We've removed some of that weight off of the front wheels so that when he does hit a bump, the front just gently glides up and over instead of digging in. So even though he has a smaller front wheel, the chair is still more maneuverable.
That's kind of the compensation for increasing that stability from that overall frame length with that smaller wheel, so you've got the more stable chair, but yet you're compensating through the smaller front caster and maintaining that maneuverability for indoors, for that, like Doug was just saying, that trade-off of indoor-outdoor. And of course, depends on the specific end user.
So another thing that we're doing now is that we understand much more about the frame geometry and how that frame geometry needs to be proportionate to the individual. And what you're seeing is that a lot of manufacturers now are able to modify the caster position based off of all the other geometry that goes into the chair. And this is really critical because in the past what we did is we used longer forks to create seat height. We used a longer trail arm on the caster arm, the piece that attaches the caster to the chair. And by doing so, we actually created a more forward tippy chair because we just used generic size pieces. So it would accommodate any front size wheel. And now what we're doing is we're looking at all the other geometry that goes into building that specific chair for that individual. And we're fine tuning that caster placement. And we're fine tuning it left to right and front to back. So instead of having, say, a distance that's a bit longer, what we can do now is we can decrease that distance and put that caster housing more forward. And by doing so, just like in the automotive industry, we're placing the wheels out to the edges. What does that do? Creates better stability. So just like with a car or like a race car, where the wheels are out to the rear of the car, to the front of the car, we're creating better stability within the parameters of that chair measurements. So this is critical, and this is something that, again, we've evolved over time and are developing just better and smarter designs for chairs. So here's what the before and after looks like. And I should also mention, too, that Michael's using a 25-inch rear wheel. And that's important because if you look at this before and after, look at where his seat is in relation to the wheel. The before is the first one, the after is the second one. Look how much lower he is. He's sitting in the chair. So he's got more contact with the wheel. Even if he wasn't more stable because he was sitting lower, he'd feel more stable because he's got greater contact to that rear wheel. So anytime when he feels like he is unstable, he can grab the rear wheel, he can control the chair, he can maneuver the chair a little bit better. Look at all the other dimensional changes too, that front frame angle. He's got his feet a little bit further out in front of him. Look at the length of the caster arms from one to the other. Now this, obviously, we just made these as examples. So the one is a little bit exaggerated in terms of being a longer caster arm, but you can see how different the two look. And by pushing that caster arm forward, wheelbase, distance from the center of the rear wheel to the distance of the center of the front wheel, is increased. So that's really important for every chair user, and especially for those exceptional users that are either very tall or very short. So the last little case
I'll start this one because I'm sort of the less technical, less savvy, but very brilliant therapist like all y'all, right? But this is the biggest, most stressful, hardest complaint to me. So everything is pretty good. They look good. They feel good, at first. And then you hear back either from your dealer, they call you up and they're like, man, Trish, yeah, you looked pretty good. Everything was going pretty well. But now he's complaining that the chair just feels heavy. It's not heavy. It feels heavy. The weight hasn't changed, but it's hard to turn. It's hard to push. This to me is a stressful complaint because I'm like, man, I knew what to do when you were sliding out. I knew how to fix your seating or what seating pieces to look at or changing the, I knew about rear seat to floor height and things like that, but now this is just a perception, it's a feeling, and it's probably part of the wheelchair, but I'm less familiar with which part of the wheelchair it is. So this is, to me, a really good one.
So my wheelchair feels so heavy and hard to turn. And we did, do you want to talk about the seating?
Yeah, so, we know the seating things that we're going to look at. Let's make sure that his posture is good first and foremost. This chair is going to be hard to push, just period. It's not even just going to feel heavy. It is going to be hard to push. Shoulders are going to start aching. If he, he's still here. Sitting here, kind of slouched out, in that kyphotic sacral sitting posture. What does that do in his TLSO? Supposed to prevent it, but he's still kind of getting this kyphotic posture up over the brace. Imagine in 3 months when the brace is off, he's going to be compensating for that balance and that posture through this position, right? Well, what that leads to internal rotative forward shoulders. That's going to lead to this impingement, this shoulder issues that we don't want to start him off in this posture. We all know that in 30 years of pushing the chair, there's a good chance he's going to have some aches and pains. Let's not allow them or encourage them even sooner than they have to happen. And that's really where this posture comes into play. We already talked about the parts and pieces of the seating to look at posture.
Doug and I are both staying up in the Cascade, which is about the furthest point from here that you can get in this hotel. And we added one more bullet as we got here this morning, which is the 4-inch deep carpet that we have to roll through to get around the Gaylord. And it seems like that, every year it gets worse and worse. I think it's just us getting older and older. But possible causes for a chair feeling sluggish and slow to turn are frame length, overall chair length, seat slope, front fork size, and front wheel size. And before we go on to looking at the chairs, the front fork size and the front wheel size, this is something that you'll find with a lot of the older chairs. So for example, on a lot of modern chairs, what you see is a fork that is angled back, the rake of the fork, and then it goes straight down. And it goes straight down because once you've achieved that angle that you need to keep from getting caster flutter, then you don't have to have any more of it to create height. You can just go straight up and down. So you can move the caster up and down to create some different height, to use different size front wheels and things like that. On older chairs, what you tend to see is a continuous linear angle. And that continuous linear angle means that you're getting further and further from that center point where it's rotating around. What does that mean? That means it's just going to take longer for that fork to maneuver. So to go from front to back, it's going to take longer for a bigger fork to go and rotate around. So you're going to lose some of that performance. And with a front wheel, same type of thing. A bigger wheel just takes more time to go from front to back. So that's really what we're talking about. And you don't see that often with a lot of the more modern chairs. So it's just something to look at if you have somebody that comes in an older chair and they're talking about, my chair just doesn't feel like it's performing well. Well, on older chairs, you can see some of those disadvantages, whereas a lot of times that's corrected now with a lot of the modern chairs. So again, if we look at Michael's setup on the chair here, and hopefully by this point, now, since we're really looking at his older chair first, when we get to the newer chair, is anybody seeing any correlation between the different setups? If we change one thing to make his legs not flop out, some of those changes are also affecting what? The chair not being forward tippy. Also affecting the chair not feeling so sluggish. And why? Because that proper setup overall is dialing the chair in more proportionally to his body dimensions so that he's more maneuverable in any scenario. So a lot of times if you're correcting one thing, you're correcting another issue with the chair as well. So this chair had 5-inch front wheels on it. It also had a 3-inch center of gravity. And when you have a chair that's set up like this, and like in the first slide where you saw Michael is sliding forward, what is he doing? He's putting more weight over those front wheels. So he's got a larger front wheel. He's got less center of gravity adjustment on the chair. He's going from a nice, decent sitting position to sitting more up on the front of the chair and thereby front-loading his casters even more. So every time he goes to turn, those wheels are digging in. And when you guys go down to the hall today, just try it when you're trying out some of the manual chairs on the floor. Sit up straight in the chair and turn. And then, slouch in the chair and turn. And you'll feel that difference when you're just front-loading the casters. So some of the ways that we can fix that for Michael is, again, let's sit him lower. Let's change his front frame angle. Let's open his back angle a little bit, which again is helping to shift his center of mass rearward in the chair. Add a little bit more seat slope. So again, shifting his mass to the rear of the chair. Still keeping his overall chair length at 34 inches, so that way he's still maneuverable, can get around in those tight spaces. Changing his seat depth and keeping his frame length at 19 inches. So the big thing that we also did here is we changed to a 4-inch front wheel, just like we said the last time. That 4-inch front wheel is going to allow the chair to turn much quicker. And because he is properly positioned in the chair, we don't have to worry about that stability issue going forward. We also increased his center of gravity to 4 inches. So again, shifting more of his weight over the rear of the chair so that he is more stable, while giving him more access to the wheel because he's sitting lower in the chair. And that's what those two chairs look like. So again, sitting him lower, he's got more access. He's got long, fluid, efficient push strokes. He's got a lower center of mass, so he's more stable. He is taking a lot of that weight off the front wheel, and we've decreased the size of the front wheel for him.
One other quick thing you can also have the person check is their tire pressure. The rear tire pressure is rarely adequately inflated and maintained on a lot of individuals' chairs, and that will quickly just rob chair performance and make the chair feel heavy.
Doug really wanted to put that slide in here, and Josh and I are like, man, that doesn't really make sense anywhere. But it does make sense here. Maybe we should have left it in, because tire pressure, you know, I met and married and moved in with Doug, and we've been together for a few years now, and I never really experienced life in the wheelchair, you know, prior to that, right? Of course, and I can walk. And I knew that, that pneumatic tires were better than solid tires. I mean, just we know that. But I was willing to make that compromise and that trade-off, because I was like, oh, there's no way he's going to maintain those. Or if there gets punctured or gets a flat, there's no way this person's going to do it. And you know what? A pump from Home Depot, probably Lowe's too, but I know for a fact at Home Depot, high-pressure pneumatic pump is $20. You don't need a mega air compressor. You don't need something major. It's not that hard to keep that tire pressure. I mean, well, you have to actually do it. You have to put the air in the tire, but it's not a completely inaccessible thing to do. I didn't ever really look into it because, you know, I just didn't really. But then, you know, these little pumps are cheap. They have an adapter for, you can do it in a car, you can do it in the wall, things like that. So that's something that's, it's more accessible than I really appreciated. So of course, I like to impart any tricks that I ever learn when I have a microphone. So all this is good, and I think this is really exciting. And the boys are going to talk through how they've spec'd out their chairs in a second too, which I think is really exciting. We might have been invited to do the keynote for everybody if we would have said Josh is going to walk you through how he specs out his chair. Because, right, haven't you ever wondered? So Josh is going to do that in a second. But then there's that last piece of this, is that funding, especially in America, is getting super strict. And this needs to last at least 5 years, sometimes longer. Even the seating components, they're being much more strict on. They're not being replaced as often as they used to be. And so the wheelchair lasting 5 years isn't such big news. The cushion and the backrest and the other seating components having to last 5 years before insurance is paying to replace, it's depressing news, really. But funding says it needs to last for 5 years, so that's a long time. So a lot of things are happening in that 5-year period. Like I said a second ago, my personal opinion is that very first wheelchair, that wheelchair has to go through a lot of life changes in 5 years. That's why it's a stressful situation, and to me, that's a big responsibility for somebody's first wheelchair. They're not going to have a lot of opinions about what they want it to do in the beginning, because they're just wrapping their mind around living in a new way, doing things differently. So you have a lot of influence as a therapist and supplier in the recommendations of this chair. And in those 5 years, we do know some things are going to change, especially in the spinal cord injured population. There's some research here. Dr. Geffen, who actually is going to be doing one of the paper presentations in this room after this, so I'm not going to dwell on this a whole lot because he's going to get into it even more. But there are some things that we know that change in those 5 years. But let's start with some positive things. I'm a pretty positive person, right? That, somebody is first injured, and 5 years later, they're probably in a much better place, much happier person than they were 5 days after they got hurt, as they will be at 5 years later, most of the time, right? Things are they're more accepting, happier to go about their life. They know that it's possible now. Y'all know these things. Strength and balance are going to improve. This is going to affect, go back one more. This is going to affect the demand and the performance and the skills acquisition, the independence in the wheelchair. As somebody gets stronger, as their bounce, the TLSO comes off, the neck brace comes off, all of these things happen. Balance improves, strength improves, and the desire to go about and go more places and to be more independent also, that even the capability to do these things improves, but also the desire to go about and do these things also improves. A little bit less positive things that do change. We know there is an initial weight loss, and then quite often weight gain after somebody first gets into the wheelchair. So that's the first question is, okay, we didn't really get into sizing and how you pick the width and things but that's a big question. And that, wouldn't it be nice if we had a nice little protocol or algorithm to predict that for us? We don't. But our clinical experiences, our knowledge, that's where that interview and history really comes into play. How was your weight? Were you maintaining it pretty steady? I realize you dropped 20 pounds because you were in ICU for a month and now you're finally in rehab. Where were you? Were you pretty steady? These questions that we're asking, but often there is an element of weight gain that does happen, but atrophy also happens. And so especially in that spinal cord injured population, we know that muscle mass is going to change. Not only do you lose some of that muscle volume, if you will, but that muscle, tissue ratio also is changing. That muscle's not as great as the muscle that is left after the atrophy isn't as good as the muscle when they first got hurt because there is some fat infiltration into the muscle, which does affect the characteristics and the tolerances of that muscle to pressure. And like I say, we won't go a whole lot into that because the next session is going to. And there's also overuse injuries that, we talked about the posture. We don't want to be facilitating that overuse injury if we can help it. We want to prevent that as best as possible. So those first 5 years, that first wheelchair that we're ordering and speccing out for the clients is why we often do gravitate towards adjustable wheelchair frames. We want that adjustment and that adjustability because for all those things I just said, from day 5 to year 5, it's almost a completely different person. They could look completely different. They're, how pleasant they are to be around could be completely different. Their desire and their independence, everything is going to be a lot different. And so that chair configuration in the beginning compared to, when finally, let's just say at year 5 insurance calls you up, yeah, right, don't forget you can have a new wheelchair, right? But that's a long time. Those are a lot of changes that are going to happen. And there's a lot of expectations from the frame because don't forget, insurance hasn't volunteered that new wheelchair in all that time. That's why we want that adjustability. Maybe go back one. I talk so much, Josh just is uncomfortable with me. But that's why we want that adjustability in the frame in the beginning. And also for those less positive changes, that's why we need that adjustability in our seating solutions as well. Because not only are we going to move and reconfigure the wheelchair, we potentially need to reconfigure the seating solutions as well to adapt to that weight loss, that increased pressure ulcer risk because of the change in tissue composition, etc. Okay, now. And so then the next wheelchair and the next wheelchair and the next wheelchair, those, you're going to have, that learning curve is slowing down. That changing curve of that person, their body shape and size is probably settling into what we can expect them to be as much as we all stay the same. Food does matter, right? But, that curve, that change in atrophy and tone, and they're probably leveling off and becoming a much more predictable person in shape and size at that point. So that's why we do then have the option to more tightly and permanently configure the wheelchair, take out some of that adjustability because until you've picked up the exact same version, size, shape, dimension, everything options of an adjustable versus non-adjustable fixed chair, you don't appreciate the difference that all those nuts and bolts make. It's a big difference, and that affects the performance of the chair too. So when somebody doesn't need to or isn't or won't adjust their wheelchair, don't have the extra options in adjustability. That's why the second, the third, the fourth wheelchairs can be more dialed in and tight. But remember all those changes that happen, that change in the body composition and tissues and such. This is potentially increasing somebody's risk over time as they have less padding, if you will, from their muscle tissue composition, that muscle, the quality of that muscle isn't as good as it used to be. So we do want to remember that even though that person isn't changing as dramatically, there still is an increased risk, if you will, even at year 10 and 15 and 20 after the injury from that first initial changing. And also, they're changing still. We all move and shift. I, haven't really picked on anybody and watched what you've done, but I don't think anybody stayed in the exact same position from when we first started talking to where we are now. And so even those small micro-type changes are important to accommodate, and remember as well that we want to make sure that the seating and the options and the ideas that we're doing maintain that adjustability in the long term for those changes, albeit not as dramatic and as big, but just even throughout the day. We all move and change posture, so we can't be stuck in just one posture.
So here's a couple interesting,
Just for fun.
interesting photos. These were taken from the time of my initial injury. Julie, you probably recognize the one photo. The one photo there that's in color, if you notice, I'm actually sitting on 2 cushions. So one of the things I didn't say is that I'm 6'9", and I've been injured for 30 years. I was injured when I was 14 years old, and I was 6'6" then. And the technology just wasn't there to do anything. So I did my rehab at Shepherd. You can't really tell by the photo, but the leg rests for this chair were actually made out of back extension tubes. We had to make them because the leg rest extension tubes weren't long enough at the time. And I had to sit on 2 cushions to get far enough away so that my legs wouldn't flop out. But look at the position of my body relative to the rear wheel. I'm sitting actually above the rear wheel. So imagine how much control I have. I'm already quad, and I'm sitting above the rear wheel. So instead of maybe going from 10 to 2 and having a nice fluid and long push stroke and feeling really stable because I'm sitting in the chair, I'm sitting literally on top of the chair. The other photo was taken a couple of years later, and again, I'm sitting a little bit further down in the chair, but look at my legs, flopping open, right? And there's nothing I can really do because my footrest, it's hard to tell from that photo, is probably only about an inch off the ground. And again, we had to come up with different ways to make extension tubes. And you can also see the size of the front fork on the chair. So it's got that really long front fork with that continuous angle. So I gotta have my legs right close together, or that as that caster swivels around, it's gonna hit my foot and knock my foot off the footrest. And it really shows the evolution of the technology. Now look at the position of my feet. Right together, tucked in, the wheel is right underneath my shoulder. I'm sitting in the chair as opposed to on top of the chair. So I have nice, fluid, long push strokes. Typically, higher level injuries want to sit a little bit lower anyways. So, the general rule of thumb is if you can reach down and touch the center of your axle with your fingers, that's pretty good, or palm of your hand. I like to sit so that it's easily the palm of my hand. And that gives me a little bit more power in my push stroke. And I think what you see oftentimes is that when somebody's sitting in a wheelchair and they're fitted properly, then they're thriving. But when somebody's not, then they're just kind of surviving because the human body is so adaptable. If you put them in the wrong chair, they're going to figure out how to maneuver around. Is it going to be as functional for them? Probably not, right? So I like to think about it, and I always like to throw this out there. Everyone in this room is going to get a free pair of shoes for attending this course. That's great, right? Alan Edmonds shoes. And of course, we have something for the ladies. But because we didn't know who was going to come to the course, I just got everyone in the room the same size shoe I wear. So everyone's getting a size 14. So is that going to work for everyone? So I think, you could all put them on. You all could walk around. You could probably go up and down the steps. You could probably run down the hallway. But would you be as functional as you would be if you were wearing your own shoe size? No, right? You could do all of those things, but you wouldn't be as functional. So why do we tend to fit wheelchairs in a generic way? We obviously know that by adding more sizes and more options, or configurability, if you will, that's better. How do we know that? Because over the year, every single manufacturer around the world has done just that. And you're not doing something just for the sake of doing it. You're doing it because it improves someone's mobility. Every manufacturer has added more sizes and more options and more configurations. And I think that we should think of it in a completely different way. I think we should stop calling it a wheelchair and call it a wheel prosthetic. Because we're evolving to the point where you take two people who have the same amputation, they're not getting the same prosthetic. Even if they were identical. In every way, their prosthetic's going to be a little different. Maybe their gait pattern's a little different. Maybe their stump is a little different. It's the same for a wheelchair user. Every single wheelchair user is different. Doesn't matter if they're the same level of injury. They can be identical in their body type. So why do we think of one as a prosthetic, something that's made to measure? We don't think of the other. I think it's very, very important that we all start thinking about a wheelchair as if it was a prosthetic. And for me, this is something that I've just lived with, because more than actually being in the chair, my height is a bigger disadvantage than the chair is. And when it comes to the chair, it's even more problematic, because most of the time, I can't get a chair to fit me properly. I'm a higher level injury. I'm very, very tall. So some of the things that I do to my chair, you just can't do if it was just an off-the-shelf configuration. I sit with an ergo seat. As you can see by the slide, an ergo seat is a flat section to the back of the seat. That helps me to be more pelvically stable and feel more stable in the chair. Because my leg length is so long, I also taper in my seat. So the rear of the seat is wider than the front of the seat. And I do that one, so that I can control the position of my lower extremities a little bit more. And just so that you know some of the spec on my chair, I actually do use a 19-inch seat depth on a 20-inch frame. So for everyone who's looking at my chair from the side and go, gosh, this chair is so small. My chair is probably one of the largest chairs here. It just so happens that my legs are incredibly long, so I have to have a longer frame. And remember how we talked about the different widths and caster placement to create stability. Well, I actually take that to a whole nother level, and I shorten my caster arms up as much as I possibly can. Why do I do that? By moving that caster arm as far forward, I'm creating the longest wheelbase in the smallest package I can. So that if I'm going down a ramp, and remember, I'm going down a ramp on all four wheels, whereas Doug can easily wheelie down that ramp. If I'm going down a ramp on all four wheels, if I hit a bump at the end of the ramp, I'm not going to pitch out of the front of the chair. And I have to be very careful about that, because my footrest, again, is still only about an inch off the ground, inch and a half off the ground. So when you're talking about an exceptional user, somebody who's very, very tall or very, very short, then you're doing a lot of modifications to the chair that you just typically cannot do with an off-the-shelf product. And if you look at all the different configuration that goes into actually building my chair, I mean, you can see that it's more complex than just your grandfather's folding E and J. And that's really how I've set up my chair to be optimal for my configuration. And then that's how it fits me.
You know, it was funny when we were putting this presentation together, you just heard Josh refer, and Tricia as well, to Josh as being exceptional. Yeah. And when it came to my stuff, it was like, well, you're average. I'm like, wait a second, why am I the average guy? But in a lot of respects, I am, because I don't have, I'm average size, build. I don't have any super technical challenges with getting fitted for a chair. But some of the things I do on mine to help maximize the ability to maneuver and get around is the caster placement is a huge one for me. You know, Josh mentioned his as well. And it's always trying to get just the perfect amount of clearance in the smallest package you can, though. You want it forward, but then there's also a trading point where if you get too far forward and out there to make the chair too stable, it's also going to be bumping into things as you maneuver around your home or trying to get through tight spaces. So there is a trade-off at a certain point. And just as you are in a chair longer and longer, you get to where you know where that point is, and you're able to optimize it. Same thing with rear wheel spacing, you know, getting it as tight as possible to the frame. You want it at a certain point, like when I lived in Europe, I had it probably a half inch closer than what I do now just because of so many older buildings and narrow doorways. But there's a balance again between being too wide and having good hand clearance and not being able to fit into places. Same thing with camber in a chair. You'll notice Josh and I both run, actually you run 2 degrees, don't you? Zero. He's converted.
Yep. Got to be more para-like.
As your skills get better, you realize that, you know, having a little bit of camber is nice for the way it helps the performance of the chair, but it just limits so many places that you can fit into, different bathroom stalls, different just places when you're out in public. And so you end up going with a zero chair and just minimizing everything that you can.
So, that's a really good point because Doug and I do a lot of traveling, and I think we've, within the U.S., have gotten so comfortable with accessibility that we don't think about the fact that 2 degrees of camber increases the overall chair width by about 1.25 inches at the bottom. You know, and that 1.25 inches really means a lot when you're traveling in Asia or somewhere, you know, and that's just trying to get into the elevator can be a problem. So dialing in our chairs here is certainly a lot different than dialing them in Europe. In fact, when I travel in Europe or in Asia, if I'm traveling in Europe, nobody comments about the size of my chair. If I'm traveling in Asia, they go, "Why is your chair so big?" So it's almost a complete different mentality.
Yeah, so just to wrap it up and just to sort of close, we want to definitely have time for y'all to ask questions. You've got Josh and Doug both with a microphone, so it's a good time. We'll answer any questions. But the whole idea really is that if we are speccing the chairs out better, if we're thinking and forward thinking, you know, we're going to end up with products and seating solutions that are going to allow the person using the equipment to fit better, feel better. It's going to let them perform better and ultimately affect their quality of life and just living better. So there's a lot of things that go into play, but you can really dial something in, or the wheelchair and seating system, so you can maximize somebody's performance. Josh and Doug are actually a really great example. I mean, the levels of how they use their wheelchairs, I should say, are quite different. I don't know that I've ever seen Doug go down a ramp on 4 wheels. And that affects the reason in the yeah, he shakes his head no. You know, he's faster than me. I can't keep up, right? But this affects caster placement and the need for the increased stability, and why it's more important for Josh, because Josh has these tacky handrails and he can't go down in a wheelie. He can do a wheelie, but he can't go control it down a ramp because his hands would burn up. Things like that. So this is why he's going down on 4 wheels, and that does affect the overall configuration. But the point being that we do want to think about the individual, how they're going to use the equipment specifically, so that we can dial it in perfectly for them to really have the best solution. So we do have time for questions, and I'm sure the first question will be, can I have a handout? Yeah, so like Josh said, we added some bullets this morning. So feel free, write my email down. I'll send you a copy of the presentation. It was a lot of pictures, but we will send a copy of the presentation to you. So feel free to shoot me an email, and I can get that for you.
Gentlemen, very briefly, what's been the progression of your cushions and what are you using now?
Well, I'll go first. I use a 2-inch Rojo cushion. I've used a Rojo cushion from pretty much day one. Never had any skin issues. I'm also lucky because I do have sensation. So even modifying my seated position, I've been able to feel over the years how that's affecting my body. But I've always found that a 2-inch Rojo is very stable for me. I tend to use a little bit less air in it than would be recommended, but again, that just because I have sensation.
Yeah. Is this working? Yeah. I use a 3-inch Rojo these days. I started off with a 2-inch low profile for a long time, and Tricia actually was like, you know, I think you'd really think the 3-inch is more comfortable. You should give it a try. And I was resistant to it, and finally decided to give it a try, and actually do enjoy the extra inch. It makes for a little more comfortable seating position.
The nagging wife.
Yesterday there was some presentation done with that with optimally positioned dialed-in wheelchairs. Although that they were really good for basic propulsion, there is some limitations with them. It's some of the functional things, transfers and going up slopes and things of that nature. Just have any thought on, and they were proposing ideas of chairs being made that are more adjustable for users while they're actually in the chair, to make it easier for them to transfer, for they get easier to go up slopes and things of that nature. Any thoughts?
Well, you know, I think you're talking about dynamic seating position, where you're able to change the seating position on the fly. And I think that that's a concept that we really like, and I think it has got a lot of potential. You know, always there's a trade with weight and performance. If you think about it, like I was saying, a prosthetic, you know, that feel to the chair. Doug and I both feel very, very connected to the chair, and that helps with our maneuverability. And I think that the idea of dynamic seating performance is very interesting, and I think it's a very new concept. I think you're going to see a lot of companies move in that direction because it offers a lot of benefits. Being able to change your seated position to the activity that you're doing is huge.
Yeah, like Josh hinted at, I think it is an interesting topic, and it'll be something we'll probably see more of in the future. But it is going to be a trade-off for people, and it isn't going to really necessarily apply to everyone. That it isn't going to be for everyone.
Yes.
This question is for Josh. I'm curious, because of your height and some of your unique seating needs, how many configurations or chairs you went through before you actually got to the optimal chair that you're at today?
So that would depend on who you ask that question to. If you ask my former boss, he would say I had about 140 chairs because they were coming out of his budget. But I probably had a chair every year, and I haven't, in all cases, changed that seated position. But I have, over 30 years, made considerable changes. If you notice some of those earlier pictures, my legs were out in front of me. And what I found is that it was really difficult to open doors. It was really difficult to turn around in tight spaces. So over the years, I've started to sweep my legs back, and I've done that, you know, probably early on so that I could initially reach doors, but I also did that so that I could lower my seat-to-floor height. My seat-to-floor height right now is 19 inches in the front. And really, once you start getting above 19 and a half or so, you run into conflict with being able to get underneath a normal height table. And some of the other things that I've tried to do is just to really fit well within a normal environment. Because who wants to go to dinner and sit sideways to a table? I mean, that's just not comfortable. It's not practical. You feel odd. So, you know, I've modified my seated position a lot to just work within the normal environment that we all live in. You know, I drive a 2-door car. If I sat up higher, it'd be harder to get down into my car and come up out of the car. Yes?
Right. Regarding the frogging out of the legs, the gentleman you showed as your example, I'm finding myself fitting people more and more that size, to the point where when I'm taking seat widths, because males carry their weight more in front, the seat width, their widest part is a lot of times their knees. So I'm getting sometimes a 2 to 4 inch difference between hips and knees because they just like having that space in between. One of the solutions that you came up with was the taper at the foot plate. Just trying to figure this out in my mind, wouldn't that induce, because you're going to put them more in external rotation, wouldn't that induce more of a frogging out? Or that's one of the things that when I'm trying to decide going from a solid frame to a folding frame, I can keep their legs linear. And again, you got to trade it off with what their abilities are and putting leg rests out. So I didn't know if that's something that you're finding with that legs just kind of flop out because you're bringing their feet in.
Right. I think this is almost different, this situation you're describing, because of anatomically, they're not capable of coming into midline, where Michael was. He had no limitations in size. He could come into midline, and that's where that taper, because I totally see what you're saying. If you bring it in even more, he's going to externally rotate him even more, because that's just not the motion that your situation is capable of, and so that does create unique situations compared to the simple solution with the brand new injury. He's capable, and where that frame taper does just control him in a posture that he's capable of.
Well, I would also say that just if we did the footrest taper and we didn't do a lot of the other things, then you are going to exacerbate that.
Right.
But by shortening up his seat depth, keeping his seat to footrest height so that he is loading his legs properly, we're able to control that. We're not causing him, we're allowing him to sit further back because we're adding a little bit more seat slope to the chair. We're allowing him to get in a better pelvic position so that we're able to control his legs a little bit more. Actually, and on that note, I get a lot of the control of my lower legs from my side guards. Again, I taper in my seat, so I use my side guards as almost a postural device as well. And I do that just because even though it's a 19-inch deep seat, that's still pretty short given my leg length, which is about 24 inches.
Yeah, and let me just say, we'll do one last question that they're already ready, and we're happy to take the questions to the hallway. The next presentation is going to have to sort of switch over here, so we'll do one more question, but then we'll definitely answer as long as you're willing to wait in the hall. We're willing to stay. So.
Yes.
I actually have 2 questions. One's very short. Do you have a picture of Matt in his new chair?
No.
Oh. My second question is, with this trend toward individualizing the chair, speccing a chair that is exactly what one person needs, it makes me think about the people that were mentioned in yesterday's keynote. We've got as many as 100 million people worldwide that need wheelchairs, and only about 20 million people that have them. And I'm wondering, with this trend in the industry to make them more and more and more specific to the individual, and even with that desire for the exoskeleton robotics that he talked about this morning, are we disenfranchising more and more and more of those people that need wheelchairs and don't have access?
Well, I really don't think so. And I don't think so because, as the technology becomes more evolved, we'll be able to produce hopefully better chairs for less money as well. But, again, people are really, really adaptable. I wish, and I had this conversation with somebody I think a couple of days ago, I wish everyone could have access to the same technology that we have in the US all over the world. But that just isn't reality. And if there are more chairs out there, again, people are adaptable. And I think you got to prioritize your needs. Some chair is better than nothing.
Yeah.
I wish that everyone could have a chair that is dialed in as mine because, for somebody I've been self-propelling for 30 years, and I'm a C5-6 quad. And I have no shoulder impingement, no pain whatsoever. I travel all over the world, and I'm just very fortunate, and I know a lot of that is due to fine-tuning my seated position to make me as functional as possible.
Yeah, it's kind of a tough question, if I understand, the idea of, Vanessa says I'm not allowed to talk, but really, just briefly, having the ability to dial it in for those who do have access,
I in my heart feel that that can't be limiting. You know, it's not changing the fact that we do have the more generic options and the more accessible and the less expensive option to still go maybe to the underserved places and parts of the world.
So I'll leave you with one last tip.
We're very
Yeah. Yeah. So, thanks, everyone.
We'll turn it on.
Is it working? Okay. So everybody get your yellow form for the CEU code. It's IC31097. That's IC31097.